The Apache spear whistled past Jake Morrison's left ear so close he could feel the turkey feathers brush against his skin, embedding itself with a solid thunk into the gnarled trunk of the mesquite tree behind him. Jake's hands shot up instinctively as he found himself surrounded by 6 painted warriors who had materialized from the desert landscape like ghosts made flesh, their faces streaked with war paint and their dark eyes promising violence if he made one wrong move. "Easy there, friends," Jake said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart against his ribs. "I come in peace. I'm looking for someone, and I think you might have answers I need." The largest of the warriors, a man who stood nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, stepped forward and said something in rapid Apache that sounded distinctly unfriendly. Jake had picked up enough of the language during his years on the frontier to catch the words for, white eyes, and death, neither of which boded well for his immediate future. But it was the voice that came from behind the circle of warriors that made Jake's blood freeze in his veins, a woman's voice speaking English with the kind of perfect pronunciation that suggested extensive education, but carrying an undertone of authority that belonged to someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Let him approach, but keep your weapons ready. This one carries the stench of lies and desperation, and men who smell of such things are often more dangerous than honest enemies." The warriors parted reluctantly to reveal a woman who defied everything Jake thought he knew about Apache females. Standing nearly 6.5 feet tall, with arms corded with muscle and a bearing that commanded instant respect, she wore traditional Apache dress decorated with intricate beadwork, but her intelligent dark eyes held a shrewd assessment that belonged in a boardroom rather than a desert encampment. This had to be the legendary Running Bear woman that traders whispered about in saloons throughout the territory, the Apache spiritual leader who was said to possess both the strength to kill a man with her bare hands and the wisdom to see into the hearts of those who stood before her. "You are Jake Morrison," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Brother of the one called Samuel, the cattle tracker who disappeared from Devil's Canyon 23 days ago." The precise way she stated the timeline made Jake's skin crawl, because it suggested she knew far more about his brother's fate than he had dared to hope or fear. "You have ridden hard for many days to find our camp, and you carry questions that burn inside you like poison. But are you prepared to hear answers that may destroy everything you believe about the one you seek?" Jake felt his mouth go dry as he realized that Running Bear woman's words carried implications that went far beyond a simple missing person inquiry. "Ma'am, I just need to know what happened to Samuel. Our mother is dying back in Colorado, and her last wish is to see her youngest son one more time, or at least to know that he was buried with proper Christian rites." He paused, studying her impassive face for any sign of sympathy or understanding. "The territorial marshal found his horse and gear scattered near your lands, but no body. If you know where he is, dead or alive, I'm begging you to tell me." Running Bear woman's expression didn't change, but Jake caught the way several of the warriors exchanged glances that seemed heavy with unspoken knowledge. When she finally spoke, her words carried a finality that made the desert air feel even more oppressive than the blazing Arizona sun. "We have buried only honorable warriors in our sacred ground, Jake Morrison. Those who die without honor are left for the vultures and the desert, as they deserve." The implication hit Jake like a physical blow, and he took an involuntary step backward as the full meaning of her statement sank in. "Are you saying Samuel is dead? And that he died without honor?" His voice cracked despite his efforts to maintain composure, because the woman's words suggested something far more terrible than simple death in the wilderness. "What could my brother have possibly done that would make you deny him a proper burial?" Instead of answering directly, Running Bear woman turned and walked toward a cluster of wickiups that marked the center of the Apache camp, her imposing figure moving with the fluid grace of someone who had never known defeat or compromise. "Follow me, Jake Morrison, but understand that some knowledge comes with a price that cannot be paid with gold or cattle. What you learn today may poison your memories of the dead and bring shame to your family name for generations to come." Jake followed her through the camp, acutely aware of the hostile stares from Apache men, women, and children who stopped their daily activities to watch the white intruder pass among them. The camp was larger than he had expected, with perhaps 60 people living in traditional dwellings that spoke of a community that had managed to maintain its cultural identity despite the relentless pressure from white settlers and the U.S. Army. But there was something else in the air, a tension that suggested recent violence or the expectation of conflict to come. Running Bear woman led him to a large wickiup that stood apart from the others, decorated with symbols and totems that marked it as a place of spiritual significance. She gestured for Jake to sit on a blanket outside the entrance while she disappeared inside, leaving him alone with his racing thoughts and growing dread about what she might reveal about Samuel's fate. The silence stretched out until Jake could hear his own pulse hammering in his ears, broken only by the distant sound of children playing and the soft conversation of women preparing meals. When Running Bear Woman emerged from the wickiup, she carried with her a leather pouch that she handled with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. She sat across from Jake with the deliberate movements of someone conducting an important ritual, her dark eyes never leaving his face as she opened the pouch and began removing items that made Jake's heart sink with each revelation. The first item was Samuel's silver pocket watch, the one their father had given him on his 18th birthday, now tarnished and bearing what looked like bullet holes through the case. The second was a leather wallet that Jake recognized as belonging to his brother, but it was stained with what could only be dried blood and seemed unnaturally light, as if its contents had been removed. But it was the third item that made Jake's vision blur with shock and disbelief, a deputy marshal's badge that Samuel had never mentioned possessing, along with official documents bearing the seal of the territorial government. "Your brother Samuel was not the simple cattle tracker you believed him to be," Running Bear Woman said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "He was a deputy marshal working undercover to investigate rumors of illegal arms trading between certain white settlers and Apache renegades who had broken away from the reservation. But somewhere along the way, Deputy Samuel Morrison decided that law enforcement was less profitable than becoming part of the criminal enterprise he was supposed to be stopping." Jake stared at the evidence spread before him, his mind reeling as everything he thought he knew about his younger brother crumbled into dust and ashes. "That's impossible. Samuel wrote to us every month, told us about his work tracking cattle rustlers for local ranchers. He never mentioned being a lawman, and he certainly wasn't the kind of man who would sell guns to renegades." But even as he spoke the words, Jake remembered inconsistencies in Samuel's letters, references to money and opportunities that had never quite made sense for a simple cowhand. Running Bear Woman reached into the pouch again and withdrew a small leather journal that Jake recognized as Samuel's handwriting, though the contents visible on the open page made his stomach turn with horror and disgust. "Your brother kept detailed records of his transactions, including sales of repeating rifles, ammunition, and even army uniforms to Apache raiders who used them to attack isolated homesteads and stagecoaches." She turned the journal so Jake could read the entries more clearly, and the neat columns of dates, quantities, and prices painted a picture of systematic betrayal that went on for months. According to these records, Deputy Morrison was responsible for providing the weapons used in at least 7 attacks that resulted in the deaths of 19 white settlers, including women and children. He also sold information about Army patrol routes and supply shipments, allowing the renegades to evade capture while continuing their raids. Running Bear Woman's voice remained level and factual, but Jake could see the controlled anger in her eyes as she described his brother's crimes. "When our tribal council learned of these activities, they sent warriors to capture him for questioning about his role in the violence that was bringing army reprisals against all Apache people." Jake felt as if the ground beneath him was shifting like quicksand, threatening to swallow him whole as the implications of Samuel's actions became clear. But why would he do such a thing? "Our family taught us to respect all people, regardless of race or religion. Samuel was always the idealistic one, talking about justice and fairness for everyone." His voice broke as he tried to reconcile the brother he remembered with the criminal described in the evidence before him. The journal contained more than just transaction records, and as Running Bear Woman turned the pages, Jake saw sketches of Apache camp layouts, notes about tribal movements, and detailed descriptions of individual warriors that could only have been compiled by someone engaged in systematic espionage. But it was the final entry that made Jake's heart stop completely, written in Samuel's familiar handwriting but containing words that seemed to come from a stranger. "The Apache trust me now, and I can get close enough to their leaders to eliminate the ones causing the most trouble for our operations. A few targeted assassinations should scatter the tribes and open up their lands for proper development by white settlers. Your brother came to our camp 3 weeks ago under the pretense of offering a peace treaty between his supposed rancher employers and our people," Running Bear Woman continued, her voice taking on a harder edge as she described Samuel's final deception. "But our scouts had been watching him for days, and we knew he carried poison intended to kill our tribal elders during the supposed peace negotiations. When he was confronted with evidence of his crimes, Deputy Morrison drew his weapon and attempted to fight his way out of the camp. Jake closed his eyes, trying to block out the mental image of his brother's final moments, but Running Bear Woman's relentless narrative continued with the precision of someone recounting established facts. 3 of our warriors were wounded in the fighting before Samuel Morrison was killed, and when we searched his body, we found not only the poison but also detailed maps showing the locations of our sacred sites and burial grounds, apparently intended for sale to mining companies looking to claim Apache lands. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Jake's ragged breathing as he struggled to process the magnitude of his brother's betrayal, not just of the Apache people but of everything their family had stood for. When he finally found his voice, it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Where is his body? Even if he did all these terrible things, I need to take him home for burial. My mother doesn't need to know the details, but she deserves to say goodbye to her son." Running Bear Woman's expression showed the first hint of something that might have been sympathy, but her words remained implacable. "Men who die as traitors and murderers do not deserve the dignity of burial, Jake Morrison. Samuel's body was left in Devil's Canyon for the vultures and coyotes, as is fitting for one who betrayed the trust of both his own people and ours. The desert has already claimed him, and nothing remains but bones scattered by the wind." Jake felt something die inside him as he realized that not only had he lost his brother, but that Samuel's actions would forever stain the Morrison family name throughout the territory. "Is there nothing left of him? No way for me to prove to our mother that he's truly gone?" The desperation in his voice was unmistakable, and he hated himself for showing weakness in front of these people who had every reason to despise anyone bearing the Morrison name. But Running Bear Woman surprised him by reaching into the pouch one final time and withdrawing a small silver cross that Jake recognized as the one Samuel had worn around his neck since childhood, a gift from their grandmother who had raised both boys after their father's death. The cross was tarnished and bent, but it was unmistakably Samuel's, and seeing it brought tears to Jake's eyes despite his efforts to maintain composure. "This is all that remains of Samuel Morrison that deserves to be remembered," Running Bear Woman said, holding the cross out to Jake with something approaching gentleness in her manner. "Take it back to your mother, and tell her that her son died quickly and that his suffering has ended. But do not tell her how he lived in his final months, because some truths are too heavy for a mother's heart to bear." Jake took the cross with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of not just the small piece of silver but the terrible knowledge that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As he looked up at Running Bear Woman's imposing figure silhouetted against the desert sky, he realized that his quest for answers had ended, but his real ordeal was just beginning. How could he return to Colorado and face his dying mother with this secret burning inside him like acid? And how could he live with the knowledge that his own brother had been responsible for the deaths of innocent people, including Apache families who had never done any harm to white settlers? The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to mock the darkness that had settled over Jake's soul. As Running Bear Woman stood and prepared to escort him out of the camp, Jake realized that he was about to begin the longest and most difficult journey of his life, carrying not just the news of Samuel's death but the terrible burden of a truth that threatened to destroy everything he had ever believed about family, honor, and justice in the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier. Jake Morrison's hands trembled as he clutched Samuel's bent silver cross, the metal still warm from Running Bear Woman's touch, but the heat couldn't penetrate the ice-cold dread that had settled in his chest like a physical weight. The ride back toward civilization stretched ahead of him like a journey through purgatory, each mile carrying him further from the terrible truth he had discovered and closer to a dying mother who would never learn what her youngest son had truly become in his final months. The desert landscape that had seemed merely harsh on his journey to the Apache camp now felt actively malevolent, as if the very rocks and thorny plants were witnesses to Samuel's crimes and stood in judgment of the entire Morrison family. Jake's horse picked its way carefully through the rocky terrain while his mind churned with questions that seemed to have no acceptable answers. How long had Samuel been living this double life? Were there other victims of his betrayal that Running Bear Woman hadn't mentioned? And most terrifyingly, were there accomplices still alive who might view Jake as a threat to their continued operations? As the sun reached its merciless zenith, Jake spotted something that made his blood freeze in his veins: fresh horse tracks cutting across his path, too recent to have been made by his own mount on the outbound journey. The hoofprints were deep and widely spaced, suggesting riders moving at speed, and there were at least 4 different sets leading in the direction of the Apache camp he had just left. Jake dismounted and examined the tracks more closely, his years of frontier living allowing him to read the story written in dust and disturbed stones. These weren't the unshod ponies of Apache warriors, but the iron-shod hooves of cavalry horses or well-equipped civilian mounts. More disturbing were the distinctive marks left by military-issue horseshoes that Jake recognized from his brief stint as a cavalry scout during the Indian troubles of the previous decade. Someone had sent soldiers or former soldiers toward Running Bear Woman's camp, and given the timing, Jake had a sinking suspicion that his visit had been observed and reported by unseen watchers. The sound of distant gunfire carried across the desert like the crack of breaking bones, and Jake felt his heart hammer against his ribs as he realized that the Apache camp was under attack. The shots came in disciplined volleys rather than the chaotic pattern of a skirmish, suggesting trained soldiers executing a coordinated assault against targets that were probably trapped in their own homes. Jake had seen enough cavalry actions to recognize the sound of a massacre in progress, and the knowledge that his presence might have triggered this violence made him physically ill. Against every instinct for self-preservation, Jake remounted his horse and spurred the animal back toward the sound of gunfire, driven by a desperate need to know whether Running Bear Woman and her people were paying for his quest to learn about Samuel's fate. The ride that had taken him 2 hours to complete in the morning now passed in a blur of pounding hooves and increasingly loud sounds of violence that seemed to be moving in his direction. When Jake crested the ridge that overlooked the Apache camp, the scene that spread before him was like something from his worst nightmares about the Indian Wars. The wickiups were burning with black smoke that rose into the desert sky like funeral pyres, and bodies lay scattered throughout the camp with the random arrangement of people who had been caught completely by surprise. But these weren't uniformed soldiers conducting the attack, they were civilians dressed in the kind of practical clothing favored by ranchers and businessmen, though they fought with military precision that spoke of extensive training and experience in organized violence. Jake counted at least 8 attackers moving through the camp in teams of 2, systematically searching the burning structures while a larger group maintained a perimeter to prevent escape. Through his spyglass, Jake could see that several Apache had managed to take cover behind rocky outcroppings on the far side of the camp, including the unmistakable figure of Running Bear Woman, who was using a captured rifle to return fire with deadly accuracy. But it was the man directing the attack who made Jake's breath catch in his throat with recognition and horror. Colonel James Harrison, the territorial marshal who had supposedly been investigating Samuel's disappearance, was standing near the horses giving orders to the gunman with the casual authority of someone conducting a routine business transaction. Jake had met Harrison twice during his inquiries about Samuel, and the man had seemed genuinely concerned about finding the missing deputy, even offering to provide additional resources for the search. Now Jake watched through his spyglass as Colonel Harrison consulted what appeared to be Samuel's journal, pointing to specific locations within the camp while his men continued their systematic destruction of the Apache community. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow as he realized that Harrison had been Samuel's superior in whatever criminal enterprise had gotten his brother killed, and that the colonel's helpful concern had been nothing more than an elaborate performance designed to control the investigation. The attack was winding down now, with most of the Apache defenders either dead or fled into the desert, but Jake could see that Running Bear Woman was trapped behind a pile of boulders with at least 2 wounded warriors, pinned down by crossfire from multiple directions. Harrison's men were closing in for what appeared to be the final phase of their assault, moving with the deliberate patience of hunters who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. Jake had spent most of his adult life avoiding trouble and minding his own business, but watching the woman who had shown him more honest compassion than any government official was about to be murdered by the same corrupt system that had destroyed his brother pushed him beyond the limits of passive observation. He checked his rifle and began making his way down the rocky slope toward the camp, knowing that he was almost certainly riding to his own death but unable to live with himself if he abandoned Running Bear Woman to Harrison's killers. The first shot Jake fired took down one of Harrison's men from a distance of nearly 200 yards, the kind of precision shooting that his father had drilled into him during countless hunting expeditions in the Colorado mountains. The second shot scattered the group that was advancing on Running Bear Woman's position, giving her and her companions a chance to move to better cover among the rocks at the base of the canyon wall. Harrison's voice carried clearly across the camp as he shouted orders to his remaining men, his cultured tones now stripped of any pretense of civilized behavior. "That has to be Jake Morrison. Samuel said his brother was a crack shot with a rifle, and there's nobody else out here stupid enough to interfere with our operations." The cold fury in the colonel's voice made it clear that Jake's involvement had transformed this from a simple cleanup operation into a personal vendetta. Jake moved from position to position among the rocks and burning structures, using the smoke and confusion to stay ahead of the searchers who were now hunting him with the same methodical precision they had applied to the Apache. But he was one man with limited ammunition facing at least 6 experienced killers who knew the terrain as well as he did, and Jake realized that his gesture of defiance was probably going to accomplish nothing more than adding his name to the list of Harrison's victims. It was Running Bear Woman's voice that changed everything, calling out across the camp in English that carried clearly despite the ongoing gunfire. "Jake Morrison. Your brother's journal contains more than just records of his gun running. There are names, dates, and locations that prove Colonel Harrison has been selling weapons to Apache raiders for 3 years, using the Army's own supply trains to arm the same warriors they were supposedly fighting." The silence that followed her revelation was broken only by the crackling of burning wiki-ups and the distant cry of circling vultures, but Jake could practically feel the tension radiating from Harrison's men as they processed the implications of what she had just announced. If Samuel's journal contained evidence of systematic corruption involving Army supplies and territorial officials, then every man involved in this operation was facing potential execution for treason in addition to murder. Harrison's response came in the form of a bellow of pure rage that echoed off the canyon walls like the roar of a wounded beast. "Kill them all. I don't care if we have to burn every rock in this desert, but nobody leaves here alive to spread those lies." The desperation in his voice was unmistakable, and Jake realized that the colonel was no longer conducting a careful operation but was fighting for his own survival against enemies who possessed information that could destroy his entire criminal organization. The final battle was brief but incredibly violent, with Harrison's men abandoning all caution in their desperate attempt to silence the witnesses to their crimes. Jake found himself fighting alongside Running Bear Woman and the surviving Apache warriors, their previous cultural differences swept away by the immediate necessity of mutual survival against a common enemy who meant to kill them all. When the gunfire finally died away and the smoke began to clear, Jake counted 4 bodies among Harrison's men, while the colonel himself lay bleeding from a chest wound behind the cover of an overturned wagon. The Apache had suffered heavily as well, with only Running Bear Woman and 1 young warrior still capable of fighting, though both were wounded and nearly out of ammunition. Jake approached Harrison cautiously, his rifle trained on the dying man who had orchestrated so much death and betrayal in pursuit of illegal profits from arms sales. The colonel was still conscious, though blood was frothing from his mouth with each labored breath, and his eyes held the kind of defiant hatred that belonged to a man who regretted being caught more than committing the crimes. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into, Morrison," Harrison gasped, his voice barely audible above the sound of his failing lungs. Samuel was small-time compared to the real operation, just a useful idiot who thought he was getting rich selling a few rifles to renegades. The weapons trafficking goes all the way to Washington, with territorial senators and army generals taking their cuts from every shipment. Jake felt the world tilt beneath his feet as Harrison's words painted a picture of corruption that extended far beyond his brother's individual crimes. Who else is involved? How many people are going to die because of weapons that were supposed to protect settlers and soldiers? The questions tumbled out of him despite his revulsion at having to interrogate a dying man, but Jake knew this might be his only chance to understand the full scope of the conspiracy that had claimed Samuel's life. Harrison's laugh was more of a wheeze, but it carried genuine amusement at Jake's naive questions. "Die? Son, people have been dying for 2 years because of this operation, and they'll keep dying long after I'm gone. The renegade raids that have been terrorizing this territory weren't random Apache violence, they were orchestrated attacks designed to justify increased military spending and territorial expansion. Every homestead burned, every stage robbed, every settler killed has been part of a larger plan to convince Congress that we need more soldiers and bigger budgets for Indian pacification." The magnitude of Harrison's revelation left Jake speechless with horror and disgust, but Running Bear Woman's voice cut through his shock with questions that went straight to the heart of the conspiracy. How many government officials are involved in this operation? And what was the ultimate goal beyond simple profit from weapons sales? Her tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to extracting information from enemies, and Jake could see that her questioning was methodical despite her own wounds and exhaustion. Colonel Harrison's eyes were growing glassy as his life ebbed away, but he managed one final revelation that would haunt Jake for the rest of his life. The goal was never just profit, it was land acquisition on a massive scale. Every Apache band that got labeled as hostile, every reservation that got declared unsafe due to raids, every tribal leader who got killed resisting relocation, it all served to open up more territory for mining and railroad development. Samuel discovered the real scope of the operation just before he died, and that's why he had to be eliminated before he could expose the entire network. Harrison's death rattle faded into the desert silence, leaving Jake and Running Bear Woman alone among the bodies and burning ruins of what had been a peaceful Apache camp just hours earlier. The weight of everything they had learned pressed down on them like the merciless Arizona sun, and Jake realized that his simple quest to learn about his brother's disappearance had uncovered a conspiracy that reached from territorial backrooms to the halls of power in Washington itself. Running Bear Woman was carefully gathering documents from Harrison's body and the scattered belongings of his men, her movements methodical despite her obvious pain from multiple bullet wounds. These papers prove everything Harrison told us about the conspiracy, Jake Morrison, but they also put us in more danger than you can imagine. There will be other men coming to finish what the Colonel started, and they will not stop until everyone who knows the truth about this operation is dead. Jake looked around at the devastation surrounding them, at the bodies of Apache families who had died for the crime of possessing information that threatened powerful men's profits, and felt something harden inside him that had never existed before. His brother Samuel had been a willing participant in this machinery of death and corruption, but these innocent people had paid the price for crimes they had never committed. The silver cross in his pocket seemed to weigh more than lead as Jake realized that his journey was far from over. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We can't go to the territorial authorities, because we don't know how many of them are involved in this conspiracy. And we can't just disappear into the desert, because innocent people will keep dying until someone exposes the truth about what's been happening here." Running Bear Woman's smile was fierce and predatory as she looked at Jake with something approaching respect. "Now, Jake Morrison, we become the hunters instead of the hunted. Your brother's journal and Harrison's papers give us the names and locations of everyone involved in this operation, from the army officers providing the weapons to the politicians protecting the conspiracy in Washington. We are going to systematically destroy this network of corruption, and we are going to make sure that every person who profited from the deaths of innocent people pays for their crimes." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Jake Morrison realized that his quiet life as a simple farmer was over forever. He was now a warrior in a war he had never asked to join, fighting enemies he had never imagined existed, armed with nothing but the truth and the memory of too many innocent people who had died for other men's greed. The silver cross in his pocket was no longer just a memento of his dead brother, but a reminder that some fights were worth dying for, especially when the alternative was allowing evil to triumph through the silence of good people who chose to look away. The desert wind carried the smoke from the burning camp toward the distant mountains, and Jake knew that this smoke signal would be visible for miles in every direction. Within hours, word of the attack would reach ears both friendly and hostile, and the real battle for justice in the Arizona territory would begin. Running Bear Woman was right about one thing: they had become the hunters now, and God help anyone who stood between them and the truth about Samuel Morrison's death.